talk about a bit of the argument about absolute necessity for just a moment. Focus on that side of this. I'm taking us all the way through the end of the sense about causality. Right? So, and I'll come back there in just a moment. But let's talk first about absolute necessity for just a moment. I'm going to be looking at the material, obviously, on pages 485 and following. So these, there's 10 paragraphs on pages 485 to 488. This is pages 389 to 392 in the German. And as I've said before, I said this last time, I just want to recall this, in a very difficult book, those 10 pages, those 10 paragraphs are some of the most difficult in the entirety of the book. Right? So I don't want to misstate what the difficulty of grappling with that material is. So I want to try to work through that just a little bit to try to make sense of what's going on there. I've sketched the argument in general, so you're not going to say, oh my God, that's what you said just a few moments ago. That's exactly what you're going to say, because that's what I did. But I'm going to try now to walk it through in terms of the actual material, the actual lines where he says these things. And then I'll switch over and talk about causality, and we'll talk about substantiality, accidentality, and where that goes from there. So let me come back and summarize then the line of argument in the discussion of modality is what I'm talking about here. So the account of modality thus far. We can say that the account of necessity, so we know actuality, possibility, right? Being, essence, or one. We're talking about now the relation between the necessity and contingency. So we can say that the account of necessity, and thus contingency, we can also say this is true about possibility and actuality as well. It revolves around the claim that in the absolutes, this is the fundamental, what actuality is different than appearance. It revolves around the claim that in the absolute, essence and being are one. They form one totality. One's not more fundamental than the other. Right? So appearance is always about one essence being more fundamental than the other being. Right? So it's about a grounding relationship. Right? That's what appearance is. But we're not talking about appearance now. We've shown that appearance is, the truth of appearance is actuality, and actuality then is where these two moments, essence and being, are in fact moments of one totality, namely actuality. So as such, essence here, focus on the essence side, is initially possibility. So let's identify that with possibility. Essence is possibility. Being is actuality. And it follows from that that actuality, as a result of that claim, he already makes this at the beginning of this analysis, that actuality is at once groundless and grounded. So he picks up this language from appearance about grounding, and he says, look, if you want to talk about a grounding relationship, the relationship between essence and being at this moment is both at the same time. It's both groundless and grounded. Well, let's talk about the groundlessness side first. So actuality is groundless. It has no ground. It's without ground. Because no particular possibility, no particular determination of essence is able to serve as the sufficient reason for any actuality to be. It's not sufficient. Any particular possibility is not sufficient to determine that this particular actuality had to be. Actuality thus could always have been otherwise than it is. In that sense, it's without why. It's groundless. It just is because it is. We don't know why. But actuality is also grounded. Right? Hegel loves that it's both groundless and grounded. Actuality is also grounded in that the possible is always that which gave rise to, and thus supports that which is, that which obtains, that is, the actual that obtains. So it's grounded in the sense that it's dependent on, actuality is dependent on possibility, but precisely because it's dependent on possibility, it could be otherwise. It's groundless by virtue of the same relationship. So Hegel famously concludes from this, we talked about this before, to sort of reiterate it again. He concludes from that line of reasoning that actuality is necessarily contingent. Actuality is necessarily contingent. It's necessarily the case, it's ineliminable, it could be otherwise. There is no necessity for why this particular phone is sitting on this table, this book is sitting on this table, you're sitting in the place. There's no necessity to that. It could have always been otherwise. But it necessarily, it's ineliminable, it could have always been otherwise, is a necessary feature of all things. So the standard example here is Krug's pen lying on a table. Krug was the owner of the pen, right, lying on a table, and that was always thought, aha, I refute, right, claims about the absolute. If you can't deduce Krug's pen, you can't actually demonstrate anything. And Hegel's saying, I can demonstrate that there's no necessity in Krug's pen being there, because that's the necessary structure of reality as such, that it could be otherwise. Now, as important as that insight is, that we don't live in a deterministic, as we like to think of it, necessitarian world, Hegel's just shown us that we can't live in that kind of world because that's not the world, that's not true of the nature of reality. Its implications for the nature of necessity have largely gone unnoticed, I think. And this is what leads Hegel to talk about relative and absolute necessity. Relative and absolute necessity. So the necessity we've been talking about thus far, that something has to be, could not otherwise be, is what he calls formal necessity. So if you go back and look at the handout I gave you last week where I define all these terms in terms of event A and event B, this is where you have formal necessity, could not be otherwise. And he's saying it could not be otherwise, that things could be otherwise. That's the way the formal necessity, formal contingency work. And at this stage of the analysis, right, only an immediate unity, that is, there's only immediate unity between essence and being. They could not be otherwise than contingent, right? Essence and being could not be otherwise than contingent because they are a unity that is indifferent precisely to their mutually constitutive differentiation. They're one, and because they're one, okay, essence and being are one, they necessarily could be otherwise. Now, Hegel says, okay, then the distinction between real or relative necessity, real or relative contingency, and absolute necessity, absolute contingency, flows from that claim. How so? Let's do the relative side first. That's the, sort of to speak, the easier of the two. Possibility and actuality possess relative necessity in that whatever is actual, is so only relative to, that is, notice here, dependent upon, relative to means dependent upon, the set of concrete or real possibilities from which it has emerged. Actual states of affairs always only actualize some possibilities in prior states of affairs, antecedent states of affairs, but not others. And given the unity of possibility and actuality of essence and being, these grounding possibilities can only be antecedently existing, that is, actual and real states of affairs, what Hegel calls real conditions. Hence, there is, Hegel contends, no pure possibility. But that means no pure potentiality, no otherworldly or transcendent essences. Just to ram home that point, we've been there since essence must appear means there is no God, right? There is no transcendent domain, there are no Platonic essences. Here we're getting that same point reinforced. Possibility lies wholly within that which exists. So if you translate that, right, possibility is essence, then essence is not separate from existence, it's in existence itself. It's born in it as a possibility, real possibility. Possibility lies wholly within that which exists, yet without being reducible to the specific determinations that obtain at some specific point. So there are determinate, concrete, real possibilities that exist by virtue of the configuration of this room in this particular way that are not obtaining yet, right? They may never obtain in this room, but they're here. Right? They are real in that sense, but they're real as real possibilities, not real actualities. So an antecedent existing state of affairs is the contingent configuration that harbors real possibilities within it. Those real possibilities are then the conditions out of which subsequent actual states of affairs necessarily and imminently arise. In this sense, the antecedent sets the parameters of possibility. We could say it measures for what can and must follow from it. The actualization of one set of possibilities from within a set of actual conditions rather than another thus necessitates relatively what follows. As he famously says, this is on 483, 10 lines from the bottom. This is 483, 87 in the German. Whenever all the conditions of a fact are completely present, then the fact enters into actuality. When all the conditions of a fact are completely present, then you could say, and only then, the fact enters into actuality. The completeness of the conditions is the totality as in the content. And the fact is itself, the Sache is itself, this content determined as being equally actual as possible. It was really possible, now it's become actualized once the set of conditions obtained. So consequently, the exact moment and manner of an object or state of affairs coming to be, passing away, or alteration of any kind, is the relatively necessary result of the set of contingent conditions by virtue of which a thing comes to be and exists. So that's what we mean by relative necessity. Relative to that prior state of affairs, which was contingent, it didn't have to be. But because it is, it sets up the conditions that could then be actualized in one way or another. Then when those conditions, if those conditions are actualized, if the complete totality of those conditions obtains and it follows from it, then it of necessity followed from it, and it's therefore contingent, it's dependent on them. There's relative necessity, relative contingency. So that's relative necessity, relative contingency. Make a bit of sense again? We've been here several times, just want to make sure we're comfortable with it. Because now here we go into absolute necessity, which is that last move out there on the top.
Wait, sorry.
Please.
Relative is between possibility and actuality, just to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's saying the possible and the actual relate in the sense that you don't get actuality unless it's relative to the possibilities, the real possibilities that resided in a prior state of affairs, and it follows of necessity once the set of conditions obtain.
Okay, thank you.
And therefore it's relatively contingent, right, dependent on those prior state of affairs and the possibilities there. Everybody okay? Good? But the truth of relative necessity is absolute necessity. This is the kicker, this is the, if you want to put it in these terms, this is where Hegel is Hegel. Right? Up to this point, you can say, well, that's somewhat commonsensical. It's not commonsensical. But at least it's comprehensible. It makes a little bit of sense. But then he's going to push it one step further, which is really the insight he's trying to get to, which is not about relative contingency and necessity, which is, simply put, there is no possibility without actuality, there's no actuality without possibility. Right? That's what that claim really amounts to.
Yeah.
The key is to say, well, the truth of that, what makes that possible, what that is in truth, is absolute necessity. So what is that absolute necessity about? So absolute necessity is the groundlessness of being. Why do I say that? Well, there's no actuality without possibility, there's no possibility without actuality. Well, you could say then, to stay with our grounded groundlessness stuff, right, which he introduces at the beginning of the modality discussion, you could say, okay, look, then you just showed that actuality is grounded in a prior set of existing possibilities. Right? It's the coming to be out of those, and therefore is dependent on them. It's contingent upon them. And it's the necessity of them, once they obtain, following from them, realizing them coming to be. So that's the groundedness of actuality in possibility. Therefore, the groundedness of being in essence. That's what relative necessity, in a sense, amounts to. The groundedness of the actual and the possible and the actual. But absolute necessity is about the groundlessness of all things. How so? Well, the core thesis, the central pivotal claim, as far as I can tell, that he makes on the bottom of 485 or the end of 488. This is the real pivotal claim. It comes in the fourth paragraph. It's in the middle of page 486, and I'll build this back to it, but it's there in the middle of page 486. This is 390 in the German. Is that what makes absolute necessity distinct from its formal and relative, that is, real determinations, is not that contingency is necessary. We've already established that, right? We've already shown that it cannot be the case that things could not be otherwise. They necessarily must be always and inalienably able to be otherwise. So it's not that claim. But it's the claim that contingency just is necessity. So catch the inflection, right? It's not the claim that contingency is necessary. That we've already shown. Right? Everything could be otherwise is necessary to their very nature. That's that claim, the necessity of contingency. But absolute necessity is making the claim that, no. We're not talking about the necessity of contingency. We're talking about necessity is contingency. And contingency is necessity. That is to say, that's an identity claim rather than a necessity claim. It's an identity claim. Necessity and contingency are the same. One's not the condition of the other. How does that work? This is absolute necessity. How does that work? So in the analysis of relative necessity, real necessity, let's go back to that. Contingency was shown to be not the simple could be or could not be a formal necessity, but a formal contingency, but the dependency of actuality on possibility. Right? That's what we mean by contingency. It's the dependency of actuality on possibility, of being on essence and vice versa. Essence on being, can't have one without the other, each converting into the other. And that dependency, contingency in that sense, right? Actuality is contingent on possibility. Possibility is contingent on actuality, dependent on it. That proved to be the very core of what relative or real necessity is. So relative necessity is about the dependency relationship of actuality and possibility on one another. In this sense, then, real necessity is the contingency. Real necessity is the contingency of actuality upon possibility. Dependency, contingency of actuality upon possibility. That is, that actuality can only be, insofar as it comes to be, out of the possibilities contained in antecedent states of affairs. Nothing momentous about that. Make some sense? Here's the momentous bit. But if that is correct, if contingency just names, if necessity just names the contingency of actuality on possibility and possibility on actuality, if it just names that, if those are just two names for the same relation, right, as you see it here, if that's just two ways of thinking about the relationship between, the mutually determining relationship between actuality and possibility, then what follows from that is this. If actuality has been shown to contain necessity as what it is, if actuality has been shown to contain necessity as what it is, as it's in itself, as Hegel puts it this morning, that is, as its essence, then accordingly, it's not real or relative actuality any longer, but rather absolute actuality. It can no longer be otherwise than to be. It cannot not be. Think about that for a moment, because that's a step. It's an important step in the argument. If actuality is necessary, if necessity just is contingency, and contingency names the relationship, the dependency of actuality on possibility, then to come to be, that it came to be, is necessarily the case. It had to be. If the conditions obtained, it had to be the case. It can no longer be otherwise. It cannot not be. Actuality has grounded in real possibility. The totality of conditions of antecedent actuality must necessarily be, right? If the totality of conditions there, it can't not come to be. Totality of conditions are there. That's the conditioning setup. If it's there, then it necessarily follows. Then it must necessarily be as following from, that is, it's actualizing those real possibilities, those conditions, born within that antecedent actuality. So if actuality is necessary, that it is real necessity itself, and thus is absolute actuality thereby, then here's the claim. Absolute actuality is posited now. Absolute actuality is posited as the immediate unity of itself, actuality, and possibility, relative possibility. Absolute actuality is posited as the realization of real possibilities. Notice, we've been talking relational language up to that moment. Now we've introduced something of production. We've introduced something that's producing something, it's posited this. So we've stepped beyond just simply, look, no possibility without actuality, no actuality without possibility, right? Just the relational mutual determination. Hegel's saying, but if what it is to be actual is to be the actualization of a prior set of real possibilities, and that's what it is to be, and that means it necessarily follows, the necessity is not just an extrinsic part of actuality, it defines what actuality is. Actuality is what it is only by virtue of that necessity. But that means it is dependent on that possibility, those real possibilities. And therefore it incorporates them into itself. That's a moment of every actuality, is the set of possibilities from which it descends, from which it arises. Well, if that's the case, then that's the activity, right? That's the moment now of an activity that generates actuality. That language of actualization now is becoming more central. It's not just a relation, it's about an actual activity, a process that gives rise to this. But if it's absolute actuality, it's not only necessity, but it's also absolute possibility, because it draws that into it as well. Then what do we mean then when we say it's absolute necessity? That's not just a dependent relationship. That's not just it follows from a prior state of affairs. That means it generates itself. It's naming now necessity. Is naming now not the relation between actuality and possibility. Sorry, possibility and actuality does both, but just to stay with that relation that way. It's not just naming the relationship between possibility, essence, and actuality, being. It's naming the generative process that gives rise to both of them. You know, it's like you're asking, it's like if you're in relative necessity, if you're in that modal moment, you would say, oh, everything that obtains right now follows of necessity for a prior state of affairs. Yeah. And what can we know about that prior state of affairs? I'm doing it epistemologically right now. What can we know about that prior state of affairs? We can know that it must have obtained that the totality of conditions that brought about these tables, you and I, that carpet out there, the lights above us, the walls around us, all those things must have obtained. Otherwise, these things wouldn't be here. But those conditions obtained. So, no actuality without those possibilities. And there it names a relation. None of this stuff without that prior possibilities, that set of prior possibilities being in place at some point, someplace, somewhere. That's the relational way of thinking about it. But then when you push that a little bit, that's all Hegel thinks he's doing. When you push that a little bit, then you're saying, aren't you then saying that for this stuff to obtain, all the stuff that's in the world, all entities, in order for this stuff to obtain, for it to come to be, it had to actualize that possibility that was there in the antecedent state of affairs. Yep. Well, why did it do that? Why did something come to be? We're saying that it had to have prior possibilities or it couldn't have come to be. Yes, that's the relational claim. But why did those possibilities get actualized? Why did anything come to be? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why did these things come to be? And Hegel's saying the first moment of the answer to that question, the ultimate answer at least, that we're going to get in the objective logic is power. But the first part of that answer is to say, because it generates itself out of itself. The modal nature of that is that it necessitates itself. It necessitates itself. But wait a minute. Hegel, you're telling me that that bottle sitting right there follows from a prior state of real possibilities. Yep. Of necessity, right? It wouldn't be if that prior state of possibilities had not obtained. And we all go, yeah, that means actuality. You can't have actuality without possibility, possibility without actuality. Good. Now you can start giving the counterexamples of, what about, the Easter Bunny? What about the fairy godmother? These are possibilities that don't ever have actuality. Sorry to disappoint you. Santa Claus, right? So these things look like they're possibilities without actuality. We'll deal with those another day. For the moment, let's deal with this. That bottle, actualization of a prior state of possibilities, real possibilities. Yes? Yes. Okay, fine. Let's just leave it there. Well, Hegel wants to say, no, actually, you want to know why that process took place. You've got to give an account, modally. We'll get to the causal side, but the modal side already has to have an account of why this thing comes to be. And it comes to be because endemic to it is necessity. That necessity isn't just about the relationship between possibility and actuality. It is that. But it's what makes that thing what it is. That's what he means when he says it's in itself. It is nothing other than that. That bottle is nothing other than that necessity. Modally speaking, it's nothing other than the realization of those prior state of possibilities. well then that can't be a dependency relationship anymore. Or it can't be merely a dependency relationship. It can't be merely, well, this actuality is dependent on that prior set of possibilities. It's got to be a generative relationship, a generative process, whereby those possibilities gave rise to this actuality. If this exists of necessity, where of necessity means as realizing a prior set of possibilities, then how do those possibilities get actualized? They get actualized because necessity is not just a relation, necessity is a process that negates the possibilities qua possibilities and generates out of them the actuality known in this case as the bottle sitting on Kevin's desk. Now that's not just true of that bottle, it's true of everything, last thing that exists. It's true of the world. Everything that exists of necessity. Of necessity initially in that sentence means what? Dependent on a prior state of possibilities. We're all good with that, fine. There's no non-existent possibilities that all of a sudden some actuality showed up in the world. They're all the obtaining of those conditions, those prior states of affairs, those real possibilities born in those prior states of affairs. That's all it is. But if that's all it is, then let's be serious about that. It exists of necessity. And if it exists of necessity, then necessity is what generates itself, that bottle, out of those prior state of affairs. Here's the way Hegel puts it. This is on 486. Take a look at 46. This is the third paragraph down on page 486. Thus, real necessity not only contains contingency. Everybody see where I'm at? Look what he writes here. Thus, real. So remember, real is relative necessity, right? Actuality dependent on possibility. Thus, real necessity not only contains contingency, dependency, right? In itself, that's what implicitly means, right? On sich, in itself. But the latter, contingency, also becomes in it, comes to be in it. So contingency comes to be in it, right? This dependency relationship is forged by necessity. He says, but this becoming as externality is itself only the in itself of the necessity, because it is only an immediate determinant. So initially it just looks like, oh, it's just the rising of actuality out of possibility. It's just that necessity relation. But then he says, but it is not only this. Now that's where he's pushed you to the limit. You want to say, okay, it's a relation. He says, but it's not just a relation. Why not? But the necessity's own becoming. Notice he's now saying necessity names the becoming itself. Necessity is not just the modal relation between possibility and actuality, which it is. That's real necessity, right? Relative necessity, all still good, still intact, still there. But now it's actually the doing of it, right? The creation, the production of these relata and the relation itself. But it is not only this, but the necessity's own becoming, or another way of putting it, the presupposition that it had its own positing. It gives itself its own what it's taking. So what's presupposed? The possibilities. It's generating those, and by generating those, it's generating the actuality. So he continues on. For as real relative necessity, it is the sublatedness of actuality into possibility, and of possibility into actuality, because it is the simple conversion of one of these moments into the other. It is also their positive unity. So he's just ratcheting up this. It's a relation, right? But it's not just a relation. It's the conversion of one into the other. It's the actualization of possibility into actuality. Of one of these moments into the other. It is also their positive unity. For in the other, each rejoins itself. Each comes to be itself. So notice he's saying this isn't just a relation. It is a relation, of course it's that. There is no actuality without possibility, there's no possibility without actuality. But they are actually invented, constructed, produced, clause, which we'll come to, by virtue of this modality of necessity that's inherent within it. He says, each rejoins itself, comes to be itself. comes back to itself. So possibility becomes possibility, actuality becomes actuality through this process. So now we've moved from relational language to processional language. He continues. And so it is actuality. That's how you got to that's how you get actuality, is through this process. Yet an actuality that is nothing but this rejoining of form with itself. There's no actuality outside of this process. This is what produces the process. Right? The process produces or creates actuality. And so it is actuality. Yet an actuality that is nothing but this rejoining of form with itself. Its negative positing of these moments is thereby itself the presupposing or the positing of itself as sublated, of the positing of immediacy. The positing of immediacy is literally, where does anything come from? How is it generated? It's generated precisely by this process. Now, having said that, right, that paragraph is really about, okay, look, what you thought was just a relation turns out to be a process of one becoming in the other. And by virtue of becoming in the other, becoming itself. So possibility becomes possibility by virtue of, there is no, prior real possibilities until those real possibilities obtain actually. That's the claim. This is like the cause and effect argument later. Right? There is no possibilities without the actualization thereof. So he's saying what looks to be relational turns out to be processional. It's really what does the work. But then he says, okay, then what's that process? What's that all about? Next paragraph down. But it is precisely in this positing, the positing of immediacy, the positing of actuality, that this actuality is determined as negative. You have the negative, as a negative. So now he's saying, okay, you wonder how this works? It works through negativity. How does it work through negativity? Look what he says. It rejoins itself. That was the language we just used. It comes back to itself. So you could be talking about actuality here, which is what he's talking about, but you could also say possibility does this as well. They come to be themselves from the actuality which was real possibility. So let's do the actuality side. It comes to be itself. It rejoins itself. Through what? Through actualization of that real possibility. It rejoins itself from the actuality that has real possibility. This new actuality, the one that came to be out of the prior state of affairs, thus comes to be only out of its in itself. You want to say, no, it didn't. It came to be out of the possibility. But what's the possibility? The possibility of it lies within it. It came to be out of itself. That's it. It belongs to it. That's what it is. He says, new actuality comes to be only out of itself, out of its in itself, out of the negation of itself. Now, this is the hinge for Hegel. This is the pivot. This is what makes it work or not work. Actuality is engendering of itself out of the possibility that belonged to itself. How does that work? Consequently, it is at the same time immediately determined as possibility. So the moment you get actuality is the moment you get possibility. It's engendering of both of them. As mediating by virtue of what? Its negation. What's doing the work? Negation. So what's negation doing? It's both generating actuality by negating possibility as mere possibility and making something actual, but actually it's producing in the actuality, by producing the actuality, it produces the possibility. It produces both. Consequently, it is at the same time immediately determined as possibility as mediated by virtue of its negation. But accordingly, this possibility is immediately nothing but this mediating. There's no possibility before this mediating. It's the negative work is what's doing it. There's no possibility just laying there. This is why I say this is not harboring these possibilities as mere potencies. They can be actualized at any time. No. The possibility is generated in the process of actualization itself. But accordingly, this possibility is immediately nothing but this mediating, in which the in itself, namely the possibility itself, and the mediating, both in the same manner, are positiveness. Positiveness is Hegel telling you both possibility and actuality are generated, produced. Now he tries to give you a summary of that. And this summary is incredibly dense, but he does say everything he wants to say about this. Thus it is a necessity that is equally the sublating of this positiveness, or the positing of the immediacy and of the in itself, just as in this very sublating, it is the determining of it as positiveness. Hegel's saying, look, necessity just names not the relation, but the process of generating both actuality and possibility itself. That's what he's just arguing. He then follows that with this. It is necessity itself, therefore, that determines itself as contingency. Necessity determines itself as contingency. It determines itself as this process, because contingency names this process as well. What is that? He defines it. In its being, it repels itself from itself. In this very repelling has only returned to itself, and in this turning back, that is its being, has repelled itself from itself. It repels itself from itself, and in repelling itself from itself, it comes to be itself. That's negation. That's determinate negation. Generating both possibility and actuality, named as necessity, named as contingency. Cool. Now we have to think about this necessity not as relative necessity, relational necessity, that's still true. Not as a real or relational contingency, that's still true, that's dependency relationship still there, but now as the generative process of both moments and of their relation to one another. How should we think of that? He tells you on 487, this is 391 in the German, 487, the first full paragraph down. Absolute necessity, that's what we've got to, right? That's what the name of this determinate negation is. Absolute necessity is therefore the truth in which actuality and possibility in general, as well as formal and real necessity, return. It's what all of them emanate from, it's what all of them belong to. Absolute necessity is the truth of all of them. As we have just seen, you want to go, did we just see this? But here's his summary now of what he thinks he's just shown, what he takes himself to have just shown. It is being that in its negation, in essence, refers itself to itself and is being. Is that what we just said? It's exactly what we just said. Right? Being, listen to it again. It is being, actuality, which in its negation, actuality negates itself. Right? Because of its negating itself, in essence, it generates possibility, that's essence, refers itself to itself. It comes to be itself out of that possibility. And he says, and is being, it is actuality. So it generates itself. It is equally simple immediacy or pure being and simple immediate reflection or pure essence. I don't care which side you take of this. He's saying each is there. So this is a kind of culminating moment in the logic, the objective logic. He's saying when how essence and being relate, they relate modally in terms of absolute necessity, which is absolute contingency. He then says that the two are one and the same. Being and essence are the same. Pure essence, pure being are one and the same because they're generated by something that they are both products of. Then he says, the absolutely necessary only is because it is. It only is, it only exists because it is. It otherwise has neither condition nor ground. It is because it generates itself. It is because it is. It's self-generative. But it equally is pure essence. It's being, the simple immediate reflection. It is because it is. Why is it? Because it's the realization of possibility. It's the realization of essence, real possibility. As reflection, it has a ground and a condition, but only itself for this ground and condition. It is its own ground and its own condition. Those don't exist outside of it. The process incorporates both moments and generates both moments. That's why it incorporates both moments. So it is because it is. As reflection, it has a ground and condition, but only itself for this ground and condition. It is in itself, but its in itself is its immediacy. Its possibility is its actuality. Its possibility is its actuality. It generates that out of when it generates itself as actuality. It is, therefore, because it is. There's it all put together, essence of being put together. As the rejoining of being with itself is essence, and because the simple is equally immediate simplicity, it is being. Now, let's walk back through both of those passages for just a moment. Let me try to explicate them again. So take a look on 486. Again, back up, this is paragraph 5 in the totality of all those paragraphs, but it's 9 lines up from the bottom. Oh, sorry, 7 lines up from the bottom. It is therefore a necessity itself. Everybody see on that? So it is therefore necessity itself that determines itself as contingency. In its being, it repels. So in its being, that is, in the new actuality that arises out of the real possibilities of the preceding actual state of affairs. So in this actuality, in its being, it repels itself from itself. Real necessity posits the new actuality by grounding it in and realizing it as the actualization of the real possibility in the antecedent actuality. That's how we get actuality, through that process. So it repels itself from itself. That's how we get it to be. It negates itself. And in this very repelling has only returned it to itself. So in the grounding, in grounding the new actuality by actualizing the antecedent real possibilities, real necessity returns to itself because real necessity is what posited the real possibility. It generates the actuality, it generates the real possibility. And in this return, as its being has repelled, and in this return, as its being has repelled itself from itself, that is, in positing real possibility, returning to itself through the process of actualization, through determinate negation. Its being, as its ground, the process of real necessity has only repelled itself as possibility from itself, as actuality. So real necessity and real contingency turn out to be the same damn thing. It looked like they named relations. They really named a process. That's what he's trying to capture with the it is because it is stuff. So look at that line again, the middle of page 487, that paragraph right in the middle. Absolute necessity is therefore the truth in which actuality, possibility in general, as well as formal and real possibility return. Absolute necessity, it says, only is because it is, emphasizing only is because it is. It is without condition, without ground, which is to say it is being, formal, real, and absolute actuality. It is because, emphasizing the because, it is. As reflection, it has a ground and a condition, but that ground or condition is itself. Therefore, it is therefore because it is. So as self-determining negation, it constitutes being, real actuality, precisely by grounding it in essence, real possibility, and constitutes essence, so the other side, precisely by actualizing it in actuality. It is absolute contingency, and therefore it is the negative self-relation. Now, Hegel at that point says, next paragraph down, that process generates everything, and it's blind. Has no directionality. So think of that for just a moment. That means that a prior state of affairs has real possibility in it. There's no destiny, there's no inevitability that a prior state of affairs bearing certain real possibilities in it is going to give rise to something that follows from it. So there's no teleological necessity, as we tend to think of it, standardly think of it, classically, traditionally think of it, that brought about this model or anything else that exists. It just is because it is. But its isness, the fact that it exists, is a result of a process that engendered it. That process has no directionality to it, no destination that it's headed towards, no final cause directing it along its pathway. Blind. But that means that we've reached a point where we're talking about something that produces, the other language we would use for that is causes something to be. So now we're not just talking modal language anymore. We're not talking about the modal determinations simply. We are talking about those, but we're not merely talking about modal determinations anymore. We're forced by seeing what modality is to move beyond modality itself. Modality transforms itself beyond relational terms, which is what modal logic standardly works in, something that is not any longer relational. It's processional because it's processional. It's generative because it's generative. The best way to think about it, the way that it demands to be thought of, what it is in its truth, is causal. So there's the limitation. Doesn't have a destination, it's blind. But as he says, take a look, because he's kind of putting all these things together. So he says on 487, I'm just going to pick some passages here. This is the final paragraph on 487. Absolute necessity is thus the reflection or form of the absolute. Here's where I got the, let's think about modality as form, the other as content, it calls it the form of the absolute. The unity of being in essence, simple immediacy, that is absolute negativity. On the one hand, therefore, its differences are not like the determinations of reflection, but an existing manifoldness, multiplicity, a differentiated actuality in the shape of others, independently subsisting over against each other. So this is how we get the world and all its variety and diversity. Right? We get all that. On the other hand, since its connection is that of absolute identity, it is the absolute conversion of its actuality into its possibility, and its possibility into its actuality. That's what we've shown, right? Is that absolute necessity is just the unending conversion of actuality into possibility and possibility into actuality. Can't stop it. Constantly going on. He then says, absolute necessity is therefore blind. On the one hand, the two different terms determined as actuality and possibility have the shape of immanent reflection as being. They are therefore free actualities, neither of which reflectively shines in the other, nor will either allow in it a trace of its reference to the other, grounded in itself. Each is inherently necessary. Necessity as essence is concealed in this being. So here's the being-essence relationship. Necessity just is essence concealed in being. The reciprocal contact of these actualities appears, therefore, is an empty externality. The actuality of the one and the other is the possibility that is only possibility contingency. So he's showing everything that we've talked about, all the real senses of these terms is engendered by this absolute necessity process. But then he says on 488, 392 in the German, but this contingency is rather absolute necessity. He picks up that side, follows that through a bit. And then he says this. I always like this because it's kind of the brutality of what he thinks he's shown, the austerity of what he's shown. So this is 488, still in that middle paragraph, but this contingency is rather absolute necessity. Everybody see where I'm at? Go down to further than halfway down the page to the line that says, this manifestation of what determinateness is in its truth. Determinateness is italicized. This manifestation of what determinate is in its truth. So he's coming back to this line of, what do we mean by manifestation? What's the form of manifestation? This manifestation of what determinate is in its truth, that it is negative self-reference, self-relation, is a blind collapse into otherness. Without destiny, without provision, without teleological, none of that. It's a blind collapse into otherness. In the sphere of immediate existence, the shining or the reflection that breaks out in it is a becoming, a transition of being into nothing. He's going back and saying, look, when we started the book, we started off with being falls into nothing, nothing collapses into being, right? Well, here's why it does that. Because of absolute necessity. We didn't know that then. We couldn't know that then. But that's why that process takes place. We now know the modal structure of that process, and we're beginning to see what the actual process is on its own terms. But conversely, being is equally essence, and becoming is reflection or shining. Thus, the externality is its inwardness. The outer is the inner. Their connection is one of absolute identity, and the transition of the actual into the possible, of being into nothing, is a self-rejoining, coming back to itself. Contingency is absolute necessity. It is itself the presupposing of that first absolute actuality. Now, that's its blindness. It's not going anywhere. It's not reaching a destination. It's not going to end or tell us that it's trying to fulfill. It's just the continual overturning of actuality into possibility and possibility into actuality. It's blind. But that identity between actuality and possibility bears its advance. He says in the next paragraph down, this identity of being with itself in its negation, it now negates itself. It negates itself in precisely the way we've just seen. The actual engenders itself by engendering its possibility and canceling out that possibility as mere possibility, actualizing itself. It engenders itself. is now substance, he says. We move from the modal form to the content, the causal content. It is its unity as in its negation, or as in contingency, and so, as relation to itself, it is substance. The blind transition of necessity is rather the absolute's own exposition. He picks up on this in the substance discussion and says the substance exposits itself, right? Exposes itself. How so? Through its accidents. And that's the beginning of the discussion of accidentality. There is no substance unless it actually gives rise to accidents. Therefore, it's accidentality. That's what substance is. It's a process. It's movement in itself, which in its externalization reveals itself instead. There's that language again of it is just its revelation, it is just its manifestation. There's no substance that's being revealed behind it, right, underlying it. Substance just is that process itself. Now, take a look at the top paragraph on 489. And I love this paragraph because it's like Hegel saying, I know I just put you through torture. I know I just put you through some dense, murky stuff about modality. Here's what I'm trying to say. This is one of those rare moments where Hegel comes up for air, and says, here's what I'm trying to say. These are summary, right, transitional passages. 489, top paragraph, beginning of the absolute relation chapter. Absolute necessity is not so much the necessary, that which has been brought about. It's not the actual. So don't think absolute necessity is what it produces on that side. Even less a necessary, so it's not possibility either. What is it then? But necessity, being simply as reflection. So he's going back to the beginning and saying, this is that movement we've been tracking since becoming, since the nodal line, since infinitizing, since reflection, since appearing. It is relation because it is differentiating, unterscheiden, right, is the term here. It's not distinguishing, it's differentiation, whose moments are themselves the whole totality of necessity, and therefore subsists absolutely, but do so in such a way that their subsisting is one subsistence. Actuality and possibility just are as moments of one whole, one totality. And the difference between actuality and possibility, and the difference only the reflective shine of the movement of exposition. It's just that process. That's all that's going on there. That's all actuality and possibility really mark, is the two moments of that process of necessity, contingency. And this reflective shine is the absolute itself. So that process, that's the absolute. There's no absolute beyond it. That's the absolute. Now, he said it, and typical of Hegel, he wants to say, let me say it again, because no way you got it from that. Let me just restate it again. Essence as such is reflection or a shining. Well, I thought we knew that already. We did, but look at what it really means now. As absolute relation, not as essential relation. As this absolute relation. However, essence is the reflective shine posited as reflective shine. So now, it's not the depth that gives rise to the surface, it's the moment of possibility that's given rise to out of the movement of absolute necessity, which also gives rise to actuality as well. One which, as such self-relating, is absolute actuality. It's both moments. Absolute, first expounded by external reflection, as absolute form or as necessity, now expounds itself. This self-exposition is itself positing. Self-positing is the processional language, right? The activity language. And it is only this self-positing. Just to remind you again, right? It's nothing outside of this. Then, here's where you know Hegel is like, I know you need help, so let me give you some help. He literally gives you an example, right, of what he's talking about. One of the rare times in this book where Hegel will come up and say, okay, you need an analogy. Here's one. Just as the light of nature is not a something, nor is it a thing, but its being is rather only its shining. So think about that for a moment, right? Hegel's trying to appeal to, look, there's not a thing that gives light. People say, well, of course, it's like a light up there. There's a sun. They say, no, just look at the light itself. The light is its own activity, its own process. That's all it is. It's not a something, nor is it a thing. But its being is rather only its shining. So he says, hold on to that for a moment. Don't worry about where this light is coming from and what it's lighting up. Just think about the lighting itself. And his point is, it's self-generative. He then says, so manifestation, so the light of nature is supposed to help you understand what the ontology of the entirety of the world is. So manifestation is self-identical absolute actuality. It's just like that. It's just like that. So the sun, you want to stay with natural light, the sun is what here? Real possibility. The earth being lit up, real actuality. What is the lighting? The lighting is the process that engenders both of those. You say, well, that's not how that works. We know better. Right? The sun gives off light. Hegel says, it's an analogy, my friends. It's not literally true. Right? So, it's an analogy that's supposed to help you understand what I'm claiming. And what I'm saying is that the light gives you a way of trying to understand how both moments arise out of it. So if you want to stay with the analogy that he's given us, you would say properly, given what he said about the metaphysics, what he's been arguing about the metaphysics, is that when something's lit up is when you have the sun. The lighting process is what engenders that which is lit and that which did the lighting. Now, he's about to make that same argument about causality. The effect generates the cause. And the cause generates the effect because causality, the process of lighting here, engenders both. And yes, you could, if you look at it formally, that is, you extract out the moments of cause and effect, go get the sun, go get the earth. You can say, okay, what causes the sun to light up? And you can go back and back and back and figure that out. You can do an infinite regress on that. And what causes the earth, to give off, what does the earth give off light to other things too? How does it light up other things? Because it reflects. Go through that infinite. He says, there's your spurious infinity here. You can do that, absolutely, no problem. That's the spurious infinity that's endemic to causality. But that's extracting the moments from the process. The process engenders both of those moments. So what is the process? The process that engenders both of those moments is engendering both those moments from out of itself. So it's not being caused by that which causes the sun to light up. It's not being caused by the effect. It's not being producing effects by what the effects of the earth are on other things. It's producing that of itself. It's self-generating, self-causation. Now, if that begins to make some sense, we okay with that? The claim is that this process of determinate negation is self-engendering. That's to put it in classical metaphysics terms, we just said, so determinate negation is God. Yep. That's exactly what he just said. He's got no problems with that. He just doesn't think that, most religions understand God as determinate negation. They don't. Nobody understands anything as determinate negation. It's nuts. But that's what he's claiming, right? And he thinks that that's what, not just his little crazy view is, but that's what actually the determinations of these concepts entail. So when he talks about causality in this way, take a look at let's take a look at what he does with causality here. Take a look on page 503. He says that causality reveals itself, shows itself in terms of this concept of power. So if we're going to talk causal, and we've been talking about it in modal, formal terms up to this point, we haven't really talked about what's doing this. Right? We want to ascribe agency. What's doing this? And he says the only thing you can use for that is power. And initially you would think, well, it's a powerful substance that's doing this. There you go, there's your God. He says, actually, no, the power is in the causality itself, not in one side. then what is power all about? How does it really work? He says this here. Actually, let me back us up a little bit so I can show you where he starts this. I don't know what I mean by this here. Yeah. So let's just walk our way through formal, relative, and absolute causality. Right? Make some sense of this. So, if you think about substance as primary, let's take it that, go back to that moment. Think of that substance as primary. It's the cause of its effects. So the substance is the power then that gives rise to its effects, and he calls that formal causality. It's called formal causality, he says, because it's the non-posited original. Right? The substance is the non-posited original. It's what brings about everything else, but was not itself brought about. It's the non-causal cause. It is that which posits an effect, but is not itself, at least at this stage, positive. Now, caveat there, right? That's not going to be true in a minute. But for the moment, one side causal, other side effects. And he writes this. This is on page 494, so I'm backing up quite a bit, sorry. 494, 6 lines from the top. 494, look down, 6 lines from the top. The effect is therefore necessary. The effect is therefore necessary. The effect is therefore necessary. This is 398 in the German. The effect is therefore necessary because it is the manifestation of the cause, or is this necessity that the cause is. So it's the manifestation of the cause. That's what the effect is. The cause is necessary, follows from the effect follows from the cause. I'm trying to come in. It follows from it of necessity. So that's how it works. Only as this necessity is the cause, only as this necessity is cause self-moving, self-initiating, without being solicited by another. So he's saying, look, looks like the substance causes itself. This is what Spinoza called the in itself, by itself, for itself feature of substantiality. Only as this necessity is cause self-moving, self-initiating, without being solicited by another, self-subsisting source of production out of itself. It must effect, it must actualize, it must happen by another self-subsisting source of production. It must affect, its originalness is this, that it is because its immanent reflection is a positing that determines, and conversely the two are one unit. So the cause is completely manifested in the effect. This will start to sound familiar. The cause is completely and wholly manifested in the effect. No necessity it is. So that means the cause and the effect are the same. There's no effect without the cause, there's no cause without the effect. The causality then that we're talking about here that has both of those as moments is a process. And we don't have to talk about the cause or the effect, we can just talk about the causal process now. But that means that what looked to be primary, substance as cause, has now been, so to speak, demoted from that primacy. It's now on the same plane as effect. They are both moments of the process known as causality. But that means you can extract them from that process as moments. Right? You can extract them both as moments of that process. He refers to that as determinate causality. And on, over on page 497, this is 402, 498, 402, 402 in the German, 498 really in the English. He gives this example of rain that I mentioned last time as well, right? So come back to that. And he says, you can pull out and you can say, well, the cloud caused it to rain and the rain caused the wetness. Right? So you separate out the cloud as the cause, you separate out the wetness as the effect. You can separate those out. And you could go, well, what caused the clouds to bring about rain? You can talk about the effect of wetness on other things. So you can do the spurious infinity down either side. He says that's determinate causality. That's where you separate cause and effect from the causal process itself and examine them on their own terms. They stand on their own. Right? They're able to do that. So you can talk about the cloud and what brought about the rain out of it, and you can talk about the wetness and what it did to things because it was wet. But the real question, he's saying, is the raining process itself. This is like the light. It's the raining process itself. And he writes on page 500 now. first full paragraph down on page 500, this is 404 in the German. The outcome of the movement of the determinate relation of causality is then this, that the cause does not just expire in the effect, does not just expire in the effect, and thereby the effect as well, as in formal causality, but that by expiring in the effect, the cause comes to be again. That's where things go crazy, right? This cause doesn't just bring about an effect, the cause is brought about by producing the effect. That the effect vanishes in the cause, but equally comes to be again in it. They are what they are by virtue of the other. Each of these determinations sublates itself in its positing and posits itself in this sublating. You don't get cause without effect, you don't get effect without cause. They both are engendering of one another. We like to think it's a one-way street. Causes bring about effects. But his argument is that effects actually produce causes, just as much as causes produce effects. That's what it means that they sublate themselves in the other. Causality thus presupposes itself or conditions itself, produces itself. The previously only implicit identity, the substrate, is therefore now determined as presupposition or posited as against the efficient causality. So now, what looked to be the substance, which was the primary cause, is itself produced, is itself posited, is itself caused. And the reflection hitherto only external to the identity is now in relation to it. Now, I'll come back to this material again next quarter, so I want to let it sit there for just a moment, but I do want to go to one other passage and then leave it there and we can have a general discussion. He then talks about how in generating itself, causality, right, in generating itself, generates both active substance and passive substance. Right? So active as cause, passive as effect. So that substance is the same. It's not two substances interacting. Right? We tend to think about this as two substances interacting. But Hegel's saying actually they're the same damn substance. It's just substance as cause and substance as effect, active and passive. He says, top of page 503, 407 in the German. Further, causality behaves in all this as passive substance. But as we've seen, the latter, passive substance, becomes causal through the effect it incurs, it receives. So when causality engenders itself, that power, mocked, is incurred upon, engenders its own effect, that's it acting as violence, right? Gewalt. Right? So Hegel says that's where mocked becomes Gewalt, where it incurs, it suffers this. But that's just engendering itself. It's really mocked engendering itself, power producing itself. The first cause, the one that acts first and receives its effect back into itself as a reaction, thus comes up again as a cause, whereby the activity that in finite causality runs into the bad infinite progression. The cause of the cause of the cause of the cause are the effect of the effect of the effect of the effect. He says here we see what? Is bent around and becomes an action that returns to itself, an infinite reciprocal reaction, action. It engenders itself and engendering its other. Now, Hegel wants to say that that's the movement of manifestation. That everything that exists is a product of that process. That process is absolute necessity in terms of its form, and its reciprocal causality in terms of its content. So if you want to know what that bottle is, you can say that bottle is absolute necessity. It's engendered by determinate negation. What does that mean? That it produces itself out of itself. So does everything. Well, does that mean it just is itself? It is because it is. But it's because of that prior structure of real possibility that it engenders itself. But that prior structure of real possibility is something that determinate negation produces itself. So there's nothing outside of it. That's the sense in which everything is because it is, and is therefore groundless. It doesn't have a ground in anything else. This is about as close as Hegel ever gets to saying something that others have said in terms of the rose blooms because it blooms. That's literally what he's saying. It is its own ground. Angelina Salinas famously says, right? the rose blooms because it blooms, it just does because it does. And that's what Hegel's saying, it is because it is. It engenders itself out of itself. Heidegger has a different reading of that line, by the way, right? But here's Hegel, same claim, quite different reading of it. It engenders itself. It does that because it causes itself. So it's of absolute necessity because it's a power that engenders its own self. That's the nature of manifestation. And everything that exists, everything that is because of that, and is what it is because of that process. So, Hegel ends this discussion by saying two things about that process. We'll look at these more carefully next quarter. We'll open up the first session talking about these, because they lead obviously into the doctrine of the concept, but I want to stop us here and for today, and we'll come back and talk about these there. But here's the two things he says. Number one is that means that necessity is freedom. Freedom in the sense of self-causing. And the second thing he says about it is that process we just elaborated through causality is actually articulatable in terms of the relationship between three moments: universality, particularity, and individuality, which is the logic endemic to the concept, not a relational logic. How does that work? We'll have to see. Yeah,
Can you repeat the second one?
yeah, that what we see here finally is a logic proper to the process itself. And that logic proper to the process itself is a logic of universality, particularizing itself into individuality. That's not a relational claim. Right? It is a processional logic endemic to that process itself. Not breaking it up into moments that are related to one another, as you'll see. Right? There is no universality that isn't particularization. And that culminates in individuality. But more about that next time. All right. Make some sense? You can't possibly believe that it makes sense, though. You can't possibly believe the claim. Everything is this process of manifestation, or that process of manifestation doesn't manifest anything other than itself. And in manifesting itself, it manifests absolute necessity and reciprocal causality. That's what that is. That's what manifestation is. That's what it means to say that it's this movement of self-differentiating, self-determining. Comments? Yeah, John.
I don't know, I think at least for me it's hard to come up with questions because you're almost left right at the beginning again with this just indifferent, blind process that has almost no content at the moment.
Yes.
You know,
Minimal content, right? Minimal
very-
content has its power.
Yeah, but almost tautological,
Yeah.
right? It is because it is.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, okay.
Yeah.
You know, so it's hard to come up with a question at this point.
Yeah. I mean, does the bottle have a why? Right?
Yeah.
For Hegel, it's, well, yeah, but not external to it.
Right.
Right? Everything has a why, just not external to it. There's no ground external to it. Right? Everything's ground is internal within it. So it's self-grounded. It's self-determined. There's nothing outside of the immanence of everything that exists. Actuality just names that process. So this is why, you know, that famous statement by Hegel, the Doppelsatz as we call it, in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, where he says, you know, all I'm trying to say, this is one of Hegel's famous statements, all I'm trying to say is what is rational is actual and what is actual is rational. This is what he means by actuality. So what he clearly does not mean is whatever exists is what's rational. Does not mean that. What he means is what's rational is this process of manifesting in precisely this way.
So, and at this point, you already though have the collapse of form and content, right?
You already
the distinction between form and content has already vanished.
Yeah, that's why I'm always hesitant to use
Yeah.
this form and content language here to
Right.
make this, but I think pedagogically it helps because one side is the how. He does refer to it that way. The other side is really what the content is. In that sense. But yeah, he's clearly claiming that the form entails the content, so the form is the content. And the content then is the form. He says it at the end here. That's why he's coming back and saying, this is necessity, right? Causality is necessity. So they are the same. So it's not just the how, it's also the what. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Can I ask one more broad question?
Please.
It's related to this question of necessity, but I'll preface by saying I don't know where I'm heading. It's a fair question
Yeah.
to pose to Hegel.
Your question is blind. That's
So
a good thing here.
It concerns the necessity immanent to the logic itself. So I'm willing to accept that we reach this progression of the logic of the process, and we have absolute necessity. And because of retrogressive grounding, that's what's providing the justification for that first moment, right?
Yeah.
That being is, but it's indeed it's vacuum, it's nothing, so therefore it's nothing, nothing is, so it's making sure, right? And so at this moment we can say we have necessity there. Am I fine with saying that?
Yeah.
And so I'm okay with that because I think I have the understanding that the concept logic operates on a different sort of necessary entailment. But if we understand necessary progression to be driven by negativity, it seems that he owes us account of negativity as such.
Mm-hmm.
Because that seems to operate as some sort of metalogical principle that's
Yep.
regulating the ontological, logical account of reality he's offering here. But I don't think we get that in the objective logic at best, I think. And again, what do I know? But it seems that the best we get is a demonstration of the logic of negativity, which is not an account. Because if that was sufficient to defend any of this book wouldn't need to be what it is,
Yeah.
right? And so is it fair to demand of Hegel that you've demonstrated a concept of negativity, but you haven't that's not justified knowledge of negation or negativity itself? And so for me, at least looking at this, trying to evaluate where's the necessity coming from that's governing the entire progression of the logic, it's rooted in negation, but we never get an account of that itself from Hegel, if that makes sense.
I'm gonna caution that last bit. We don't get an account of it in the objective logic. I agree with that fully. So, and he's gonna give us one in the concept logic. You may not find it satisfactory or not, so let me preface it with saying that, but that is what he's trying to do there. So let me just, because I agree with everything you said. The only thing I want to nuance about it is slightly is this. So they're related, right? These two things I want to talk about, but I do want to remind us to try to keep them distinct. And ultimately we can't because they are related. But it's one thing to say, here's the nature of reality, and in the nature of reality there is this feature we call necessity. And necessity is formal and real and absolute. It has three different kinds. And they're all rooted ultimately in formal and real, all rooted in absolute necessity, which is his argument. Right? And so absolute necessity is a feature of reality. So everything that exists, this bottle up here is a feature of it just as much as you are, just as much as I am, just as much as the table is. Everything that exists is a feature of that absolute necessity. So that's an ontological necessity. And that's ultimately proves out to be absolute negativity. Right. So we need an account of it, absolutely. And does he give us an account of it here? In a sense, he's been doing nothing other than giving us an account of it. But the problem is that it's an account that doesn't, as I said earlier today, it's an account that doesn't actually remain immanent to the process itself, qua process. It gives us an account of what the process produces in terms of its, use this language, effects, but not the causality itself. That's where we come up short in the objective logic. So that's why I want to say the objective logic's been telling us repeatedly we live in a world of thoroughgoing reciprocity, thoroughgoing interaction of all things. Everything is dependent on everything else. That's the thoroughgoing intrinsic relationality of all things. But that's predicated on, built upon, problematic language, but process. And that process engenders those things, produces those relations, but is not equivalent to them, therefore it can't give an account of it in those terms. That's where your problem is, that you identified. I absolutely agree with that problem. I think Hegel's onto that problem as well. That's what he's admitting at the end of the objective logic. But only now can we give an account of the process, qua process. So that's that. We need to keep all of that, what I call ontological necessity as a feature of reality stuff, separate from, but not ultimately separable from, how do we move from one concept to another in the logic, the logical entailment necessity. Now they're related, right? Both are by virtue of negation. And he needs to give us an account of both. It'll turn out the account of both is actually the account of the same damn thing, right? So they're ultimately related. But let's not say, oh, well this means, for example, you might pull out of here and go, oh, well that means that all these transitions, logical entailment, are blind too. I think that's too much. Because that's a feature of the form of necessity we have here, which may not be the logical form of necessity that's operating throughout the demonstrations that we've been tracking. Does that make some sense?
No.
I just want to keep that question open as to both questions. What's the nature of the logic of this process? What's the nature of absolute negation, absolute negativity? And then what does that entail about the logic of entailment itself? Because they're related, but they're not the same thing. I'm just trying to keep them somewhat separate.
Yeah, no, I think my question comes from the logic of entailment itself, and
Yeah.
that gets snuck in somewhere. And I know that the concept of logic deals with that somewhat, but I didn't know if it was applicable aspect.
Yeah, and
Am I justified imposing that at this moment in the logic?
yeah, no, I think so, and I like what you're saying about, haven't we been shown repeatedly that negativity is doing, I'm paraphrasing your work a little, your words, so I may introduce stuff of my own. It's doing work here, but we've not been showing how it's able to do that work. I absolutely agree with that. You know, every time, you're probably getting sick of it by this point, if you're not, something's wrong with you, that the answer for all these problems that we come to is absolute negation does it. Okay? That's what that says, that's what causality turns out to be, right? So all these things turned out to be the work of negation. He prepped us for this. He told us that, you know, the fundamentals, you know, philosophical attitude has to be that negation is not always destructive, that negation can produce. That's all he's asked us to countenance, right? Is that, and repeatedly we're being shown that that's in fact what's doing the work. In fact, it has to be doing the work. So now you're quite right at the end of this, okay, the ontology is roughly done, at least in the relational terms. It's done. There's no more, I mean, here's the nature of reality, here's what it is. It's got this relational structure, it's possibility and actuality. On the modal side, it's causal on the other side, and there you go, it's manifestation. But we need to know what the process is itself, what the logic endemic to that process is. That's what the doctrine of the concept does. So the first part of that, the logic of the concept, is an exposition of that logic of the concept on its own terms. So he starts off by saying, okay, what is the concept? So the first section is the concept of the concept. Then, okay, how do we understand what the concept is? Universality, particularity, individuality. Okay, how does that work? It works in terms of those three determinations, but those work in the judgmental structures, and those work in syllogistic structures. That's going to be the account he's going to give of the process itself. And then he's going to say, okay, if that's the account of the process itself, then, coming back to this question, what does actuality look like as a process? Not as relational, but as the process that gives rise to those relations. That's the objectivity chapter, in the objectivity section, I should say, in the doctrine of the concept. And then the two of those are brought together in the idea. That's all a very simplistic way of understanding what the doctrine of the concept is, but I think that's roughly the way Hegel envisions what it's supposed to do. So, in a sense, I always hate this because it's a bit hyperbolic, but the objectivity chapter rewrites the objective logic from a process standpoint rather than a relational standpoint. It's all about processes. They give rise to relations, but are not the relations themselves. So it's not done relationally like it is done here. So that's what's inadequate about the objective logic, is it's ultimately pointing us back to negation, always. But always accounting for negation purely in relational terms, which is something that relation produces, but is not itself its own logic. You called it a meta-logic, I think it's operative in precisely that way. That negation's operative in precisely that way, and we need an account of it on its own terms. Is that useful?
Yeah, no.
Helpful?
I'll ask the question at the beginning of March.
I'm sorry?
I'll ask the question again at the beginning of March.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because that's what we'll be doing all of the rest of the next quarter, is doing that very process. Other comments, questions? I've worn you out. Yes, Suji?
This goes back to a distinction that you were making between how Aristotle's theology and ontology works and how Hegel's does.
Yeah.
So I wanted to push you a little bit to
Please.
speak a one hand, if you take Aristotle on what he says about the four causes, formal, just material cause,
Yeah.
final cause, but you can say yes, it's different from what Hegel's doing. It's absolutely different from what he's doing. But if you look at an account of energia and dynamis that he gives in the later books of metaphysics,
Yeah.
it also seems to be making a similar case where what the essence of something is not something external,
Yep.
but it is something is what it is by virtue of itself.
Yep.
So you can't have the being at work of something without its possibility, and you can't explain possibility without it.
It's being at work.
Yeah.
So no dunamis without energeia, no energeia without dunamis. Yeah. So let me respond in that a couple ways. One is clearly what I'm contesting as an Aristotelian reading of Hegel is reading Hegel through the four causes. And I'm going to call that the Aristotelian heritage, because that's been the principal heritage, right? If we want to understand, what is Aristotle's account of the coming to be of things, we think about that in terms of final causation. That the formal cause is not just merely formal cause, but it actually brings about the entire process and guides the whole process into its destiny, its ultimate culmination. So there's a telos always at work. So it's final causality and teleology. That's picked up by a ton of people in the tradition, and that's usually described as the Aristotelian legacy and heritage. A lot of them those same people who inherited that, then want to go back and look at dunamis and energeia as being, okay, well that's an explication of formal, material, efficient, final cause, and it's just giving us the modal structure of that, or the potentiality, actuality, underpinnings about how that process works. Others would want to say, actually, no, it's a contrasting account. They're not collapsible to one another. So, when I say that Hegel is not Aristotelian, I mean it in the former sense, not in the latter sense, right? And I think that's significant because there's a tendency in Hegel's scholarship to either make one or two claims, sometimes try to make them both. That Hegel is a Kantian, and so people will go down that route, and others will go, no, he's an Aristotelian. And when they mean those things, they mean particular ways of understanding Kant, particular ways of understanding Aristotle. The one I'm talking about with Aristotle is this one through the four causes. And this account is not the four causes account. That's what I want to say, simply put. Now, what about the Dunama and Energeia? I find those passages in the metaphysics dense, hard to understand, fragmentary, okay? But that doesn't mean that there isn't recoverable from them this kind of way of understanding them as, no potentiality without actuality, no dunamis without energeia, and no energeia without potentiality. My worry about that, one of my worries about that, is that it seems to me that potentiality is born within things in a way that's prior to and makes possible that which follows from it, and therefore it has a kind of logical, maybe ontological priority for Aristotle that actuality doesn't have. I know that's not the prevalent view, so I understand that Aristotle scholars will all go, well, no, the standard thing to say is energeia has priority. But I do think that you can read him as having dunamis, having that potentiality as having a greater, because there are unrealized potentials. And Hegel just doesn't know anything about unrealized potentials. They're generated out of their actualization. That's what possibility is. It's nothing other than that. So that's the worry, right? Is that isn't there still, in Hegelian terms, isn't there still in Aristotle, I don't know the answer to this question, isn't there still in Aristotle a remnant of, Hegel would put it as remnant of, right, long preceding it, of a kind of grounding relationship where the potentiality is not fully exhausted in the energeia. That's the worry for Hegel. Because if it isn't, if there's something left over in the dunamis, then you've got an inner that's not outer. You've got a ground that hasn't been fully appearing, and it's not manifesting. It's appearing, but it appears as a ground unto itself. So there's a kind of in itselfness of dunamis. That's what Hegel would be worried about. Because that would mean that's a kind of essence that retains an in itselfness over against its manifestation, its actualization as inorganic. Does that make any sense?
It does, but then I think we can go to the other books of the metaphysics and talk about pure actuality,
Yeah.
which is pretty similar to his account of manifestation.
But isn't that isn't pure actuality, educate me, isn't pure actuality in Aristotle a condition, a state in which there is no more potentiality?
But if the
Potentiality has been exhausted.
No, the thought thinking itself, I don't think it had
Okay.
potentiality to begin with.
Okay.
But it's pure actuality,
Okay.
and then all finite beings are derived or are based upon this prior actualization of pure actuality.
All right. So, but thought thinking itself is the only thing that's purely actual, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Everything else is a privation of that, to use the later language for it. All right. So, a couple things to say about that. Hegel loves that passage from the Metaphysics. He quotes it at the end of the Encyclopedia. Quotes it in Greek, actually. The thought thinking itself line. But for him, it's not about the exhaustion of all potentiality. It's about the self-relation. It's about the circular relation that he's trying to get at, I think. He just quotes it. He doesn't tell us why he quotes it. He just quotes it again. And it's still, it worries me that there is no potentiality there. When Hegel, at this point at least, is saying that every actuality is an actualization of a potentiality, where that potentiality is born within the actuality itself as its essence. And pure actuality has no essence in that sense. And Hegel wants to say there's no transcendent essence, but there is immanent essence. That's what real possibilities are. That's what would concern me in that description. Right? So that's a divine logic. It's God. It's not the logic of actuality. Great. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense, but I think the knackpunkt there is the reading of Aristotle.
Yeah. Which way we're going to go with this in Aristotle, right? So I always try to couch this as, I'm not trying to make definitive claims about Aristotle when I make those comparisons, because those are lecture notes, right, at best. They're fragmentary lecture notes. Hard to make sense of what he's trying to say at all times there. Aristotle, hard for Hegel, and he wasn't writing lecture notes here. So that. But also I'm trying to think about how did that get taken up? What's the inheritance? What's the Aristotelian legacy? So, like we oftentimes will say, I don't care if this is Plato, but it's Platonism. I'm more worried about the Aristotelian legacy, Aristotelianism, not Aristotle so much at that point. That doesn't mean that couldn't be a fruitful conversation about, well, what is actually going on? Who cares about the Aristotelian heritage? Just what's going on in Aristotle directly. Yeah, I think that could be a powerful point of reflection about the distinction between the two, or the similarity. Other comments? We're over time, so if you need to go. Yeah, go ahead.
Quick question, maybe. So we've talked a little bit about the provisionality of things as they first come up, and see how that gets destabilized in their necessary implications.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, so when relata become equated, does their, for lack of a better term, does their history in their provisional usage maintain a kind of distinction even in their new equation with one another?
Yeah, so, no, I appreciate this. This is a really important question. So, take whatever example you want to, that we've talked about tonight, actuality, possibility, cause, effect. None of those, it doesn't really matter what relata you're talking about. The same problem arises, right? Because in each case he's saying, well, look, actuality and possibility just are the same thing because they're moments of the same process. Cause and effect are the same thing because they're moments of the same process, right? Causality. And you want to say, well, when they collapse in that way, when they are just moments of one process, do they have any distinguishability? This is the way I'm hearing what you're saying. Do they maintain their inheritance they had, their history, as you put it, from the prior determinations they'd already received? And I think that's exactly yes. The answer to that question is yes. Because Hegel wants to say, look, they don't collapse into indifference. Causality still has, necessity still has a possibility-actuality moment, possibility and actuality moments. Causality still has cause and effect moments. Those aren't disintegrated and just undone because now we're talking about the process itself. The process engenders them and gives them a kind of relative differentiation. Not absolute differentiation, but relative determination. So relative in the sense that they are now, so let's take an example like this. Possibility is the way of thinking essence, right? Cause would be the way of thinking essence. Do we retain everything that we had about cause and when we first got to cause? No. But one, because causes aren't inherently self-identical. They are self-othering. But now we know what that self-othering actually is, right? That self-othering is not the thing giving rise to properties or the force giving rise to expression. It is possibility giving rise to actuality. It is cause giving rise to effect. That's what really essence, as that side, is. And now we know what being is, right? Being is actuality, not just concrete. It's not grounded being. It is now actuality. It is now effect. So it is those things. So it has a kind of determination that is preserved in being a moment in that process. It's not collapsed and disintegrated, becomes indifferent, undifferentiated. That's what he says happens at the beginning of the absolute, right? The absolute is just pure indifference. It has nothing to it, has no determination, except for it has this mode or way of being, right? The mode or way of being is this process. Well, that's what we capture with modality, and then we move to causality from there. But we don't fall back into that indifference again, right? They have their moments, and they retain that relative independence. Be cautious about that language, but that relative distinction and determination as a moment of that process. They're just not absolute unto themselves. Is that useful?
Yeah, definitely. So then when he continues using a word even after the collapse has taken place, we can still regard it with some amount of the difference that it maintains in itself, even though we know that it's already been equated with its other.
Yeah.
But we just are now keeping in mind the process whereby that happens.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about that? I'm sorry.
No, go on.
So I think you can see this particularly in the modality discussion, but it's true in the causality discussion as well, that Hegel will say, look, I'm now talking about cause. I'm now talking about necessity. And then he'll qualify. He'll say, I'm talking about necessity as real necessity. I'm talking about cause as formal cause. So he'll give you qualifications of it. So I'm now going back to an earlier determination, but I'm going to show you how out of the process that sense of necessity, that sense of cause arose. So you can have that, right? It's still there. It's not able to be had on its own, but it is generated out of this process itself. So this is where he wants to say prior determinations are not true unto themselves. The truth of them lie in what follows from that initial determination, but it then is grounded in, use that general language for that, in this later moments. It makes it possible to be what it is. So we can still talk essence. We can still talk being, because we can talk possibility, we can talk cause, we can talk actuality, we can talk effect. We can talk reflection because we can talk necessity, contingency, causality. So all of those things that were initially determined and we saw ultimately fail, don't fail absolutely. Right? They're canceled in their provisional character, and they're taken up again in their being shown to be grounded in this later moment. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yes, that's good. All right, guys, I really appreciate this quarter. I know some of you are continuing on, some of you are not. I appreciate the patience you've shown with me going through this stuff. I love this stuff, as you can tell. Everybody else does not share that love, disease, whatever that. And so I appreciate you being patient enough to go through this. I hope you found it interesting, useful, challenging. I look forward to seeing many of you next quarter. Don't forget about the exegetical assignment. Get that in on time. Don't get it incomplete. There's no extensions for that, so get that in on time. And then once you've done that, enjoy the break, right? We get this thing called spring break in the spring. It's not a break, so don't be fooled by that name. This is our real break, right? So, and it's only really 2 weeks, but enjoy, right, the break. You'll need it, and then come back refreshed and ready to go because we start the first week of January, I think, or January 6th or something. So I'll see you then, if not before. All right, thank you.